Rocco. Good morning. I will briefly present you this, which is essentially a case study of one of the commitments made by industry in the EU platform. It's about advertising and marketing, and specifically advertising foods to children, which everybody involved in the platform knows is a politically controversial issue. The initiative is backed by a number of the leading food companies, and I'll come to which ones in a minute. But first of all, I'll tell you what it is about. It's a framework initiative by which each company that adheres has to commit to two fundamental principles. The first is that they shall not advertise food products to children under 12 unless these products meet certain nutritional criteria, which each company may establish autonomously, but should be based on scientific guidelines. The second commitment is about no advertising in primary schools, in line with the commitment not to target marketing to under 12s. Each member company each company that is a member of this initiative must adopt a corporate policy which meets at the very least these two criteria, but which can go further. If it does use nutritional criteria to distinguish between products that may and may not be advertised to children, it needs to publish them so they are open to scrutiny. And thirdly, it needs to submit itself to a joint annual third-party monitoring exercise, which is the part on which I will spend a little more time in this presentation because it's quite fundamental to the initiative. The initiative was launched in December 2007, and the member companies spent 2008 to put in place policies that would meet these commitments throughout Europe. We had 11 founding members that are listed up there. They're essentially most of the leading international food and drink companies. And since April this year, we've managed to recruit 6 more members in the snacks sector in Europe. And in terms of the platform mechanics, the initiative is formally owned by the World Federation of Advertisers and also supported by CIAA, which is the food industry organization in Europe. We started off with those member companies, which we estimate represent about 2/3 of food advertising spend in the European Union. Now, a year ago, the Commission challenged us to reach 80% by the end of 2010. That was a personal challenge from Robert. We reckon we're not far off that with the expansion, the inclusion of these members, and also with a bit of luck through the acquisition by some companies of others. So today, we are probably in the region of 3/4 of ad spend representativity in Europe. Now, I will focus on how we measure what this means. In 2009, and again this year, we commissioned external agencies. Last year, Accenture and Pricewaterhouse, and this year, Accenture and a research company called BDRC Continental, to one, measure compliance with the commitments, and secondly, with respect to TV advertising in particular, to measure what has changed, what impact does this actually have on the advertising landscape in Europe. Accenture Media Management is the largest media auditing company. So what they usually do is work for companies and assess how effective their marketing strategies are. For this project, they turn that principle on its head and say, well, how good are these companies at not marketing these products to children? So we commissioned them to monitor 6 markets this year: Greece, Hungary, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, and Spain, and to review a whole 3-month period of advertising. So what they did is obtain the advertising data for each spot that is broadcast on TV in any channel, on any program in these markets over a 3-month period, and to on the basis of that data, they can see exactly which product was advertised within which program or around which program, at what time, on what channel in each market, and crucially, what was the audience profile at the time of that broadcasting. And the measure of compliance is the majority of children under 12 in the program. So the commitment is we shall stay out of those programs where a majority of children are under 12 are viewing. The second piece of that exercise is to compare this data with exactly the same data from 5 years ago. And that gives you a measure of change, a very specific measure of change, because it's measured in so-called impacts, an impact being each time that a person sees a spot. And that is recognized as a precise measure of so-called exposure of certain audiences to advertising. Unfortunately, that is only possible for TV advertising, because such data does not exist for digital advertising or the print media, at least not yet. So the methodology for compliance monitoring of print and internet is very different. And for that, Accenture essentially drew up lists of print and websites targeted at children under 12 in 4 sample markets this year. And there they checked simply for the presence or absence of ads for particular food products. These are the results in terms of compliance. They are in each market close to 99%. In print and online, again, virtually 100% compliant. These figures were very similar in 2009, so it really confirms that companies are doing what they say, at least with regard to these commitments. With regard to schools, we commissioned BDRC, this London-based market research agency, to carry out a survey of a representative sample of schools in 4 member states. Again, we did this in 2009 and repeated it this year with different countries. This year we covered Belgium, Italy, Slovakia, and the UK. And they picked a random sample sufficiently large to achieve a high level of confidence and a small margin of error, and essentially asked schools to fill in an online questionnaire reporting brand by brand instances of non-compliance. That means any instance of commercial communication in schools other than certain types, for instance, sponsored materials. When these are agreed with the school authorities, they fall outside the scope of this commitment. And so each school reporting 1 instance of non-compliance, 1 instance of unauthorized communications means 1 instance of non-compliance. And as an incentive for schools to respond, because the biggest challenge of this kind of exercise is to actually get schools to respond, a €30, £30 donation was made to each school, and that improved the response rates considerably compared to last year. And these are the overall results, a 93% compliance rate this year, 1% lower but fundamentally similar to last year. And the slide also highlights the potential areas for improvement by type of advertising still found in some primary schools. This is at least in my view, the more interesting aspect of the monitoring program, because compliance monitoring is the very least that I think should be expected. These are the results of Accenture's change measurement done this year. So the column on the right shows the minus 60%, shows the decline in exposure among children under 12 to TV advertising for those products that don't meet the nutritional criteria. The bar chart on the left, minus 36%, represents the fall in the exposure of children under 12 to all product advertising by these companies. So one is taking into account nutritional criteria, what you might call HFSS, products that have higher fat, sugar, and salt content, and to the left, all products. So the interesting thing is that even if you disregard the nutritional criteria, which we know are not perfect, we can still see a drop of over 1/3 in children's exposure to TV advertising in these 6 markets. And by way of comparison, this slide just shows how the picture has evolved for the general population. So what it shows is that also for the general population there is a decline in exposure to advertising for those products that don't meet these nutritional criteria. So that shows clearly there is a certain divestment by companies from these brands in terms of marketing at least. But that when you look at all products on the left, the -3%, it is not a case of migration away from TV so much, in the sense that, at least in terms of number of impressions on the general population, the amount of overall food advertising hasn't really changed. But when we compare it to the data for children under 12, it seems to show an intentional effort to move away from that space. And the result, a 3rd decline for all products, is significant. So having done this now for 2 years, we can draw a few conclusions. The first is that, well, the levels of compliance seem to be close to 100% year on year for TV, print and internet advertising, and in the lower 90s for schools. So some room for improvement there. And secondly, we've been able to have the evolution of children's exposure measured quite precisely. And again, it shows a continuing trend in in the reduction of children's exposure, both to products that don't meet the criteria and to a lesser yet substantial extent for all products by these companies. Now, bearing in mind that the companies monitored represent over 2/3 of ad spend in Europe, and that we've done this monitoring in 6 markets in 2009 and 4 new markets in 2010. 2 of the markets were repeated. I think we can be quite confident that this trend is continuing. In conclusion, I think the most interesting aspect of this program, and that's also where most of the time and resources have been invested in actually trying to measure what this means in terms of outputs, of outcomes, rather. So how has it changed advertising? And it's been quite a complex thing to establish a methodology that would be able to achieve such measurement on a comparable level in Europe, where advertising markets remain mostly national. But the results are, I think, encouraging, to say the least. In terms of next steps, continued dialogue with stakeholders, and we had an interesting discussion on the 9th of September in the last meeting of the EU platform. That will continue, and we continue dialogue with other such initiatives that have sprung up in other parts of the world, partly copying what we have been doing in Europe. We need to continue, I think, trying to expand coverage. We need to continue the reflection about how the initiative can be strengthened and improved. Yes, recruitment of new members is, of course, a continuing priority. And in that respect, in front of an audience of different stakeholders, I can only give the message to encourage this at national level. For instance, in Portugal, we've been successful in establishing a national initiative that includes these companies plus 16 Portuguese food companies. So together they represent nearly 100% of the market, and that's, I think, something that should be replicated to the extent possible in other countries. Now, if you're interested in the detailed information about this initiative, you'll find virtually everything that I've said and more on this website. And feel free also to contact us directly if you like. Thank you very much.